Hello everyone, and welcome to the 1960 World Chess Championship match between Mikhail Botvinnik and Mikhail Tal. This is game 11, and if you remember from my previous videos, Tal actually had a 3-point lead in this match after game 7, and then he and his trainer Alexander Koblenz had this crazy idea that Tal should start playing crazy, and if he wins one more game, that will be enough for him to actually win this match. But then he lost in game 8, he lost in game 9, and in my previous video in game 10, you've seen that amazing game that both Botvinnik and Tal played extremely well. That game ended in a draw, so Tal was able to stop the bleeding, and I would like to invite you to observe this quote above the board. Emanuel Lasker resigned his match with Capablanca when there were still 10 games left. This is something Mikhail Tal talks about prior to this game. It's not that Lasker wouldn't be able to maybe win those 4 games. It was just that Capablanca was feeling so confident that he was simply playing chess that was too good. So Lasker thought that it wasn't even worth wasting his time. And this is something Tal also talks about. Since Tal was 3 points in the lead, he thought maybe if I get a 4-point lead, then that will be like extremely hard to overcome for Botvinnik. But Botvinnik just played it cool. He was 3 points down, but it was actually Tal who lashed out, and it was Tal who lost his nerves. So then he lost 2 games. Now the result is only 1-point lead for Mikhail Tal. Here, before this game, Alexander Koblenz actually gave a very valuable piece of advice to Tal. He told him, don't challenge Botvinnik to a Caro-Kann anymore. You will have your entire life to refute the Caro-Kann as a defense, but you're here just to win this match. So maybe you could try something else. And Tal really enjoyed this idea, so he didn't want to gain any kind of real opening advantage straight out of the opening. He just wanted an opening that will create the most complicated position possible to allow for some, chances on both sides. For the first move in this game, this is game 11. All of the previous games, Tal started with e4. Here, Tal opened with knight to f3, so the Reti opening. Knight to f6, g3, and the g6. And Botvinnik was never known to go for the King's Indian defense. His main idea with knight to f6 and g6 is to maybe transpose into the Grunfeld. Bishop to g2, bishop to g7, we have castles by Botvinnik, c4, c6, and here Tal played b3. Tal didn't like the idea of going d4 because then Botvinnik can very easily go into this symmetrical position with d5, and now after white develops he can always play this knight to e4 move, and this is a nice position for black, easily equalized. So after c6 he played b3. He wants to create everything on the board, keep everything on the board, try to keep it as complicated as possible, but Botvinnik immediately goes for this knight to e4 move, opening up an attack from the bishop to the rook on a1, and basically forcing Tal to push d4. So Tal does play it, we have d4, and now Botvinnik goes d5. But it's not really the same position as the one Tal tried to avoid. This was the position Tal tried to avoid. Now this pawn is still on b2, and the knight is occupying the d2 square. Now this is the position from the game, where the pawn is actually on b3, and this pawn is still on d2. Now Tal will develop the bishop here. So Tal did play d4, we have d5, bishop to b2, and now bishop to e6. Tal doesn't think it's a bad move, this bishop to e6, but he says that black will have to spend a lot of time for every move. It creates a very hard position for black, and he doesn't think this was the best idea for Botvinnik. But okay, knight b to d2, we have knight captures, and now queen captures on d2. And this was a very important decision, this queen captures on d2. If you play knight captures on d2, which seems like it could be a reasonable move, you're protecting the c4 pawn, twice you open up your own light square bishop here. The problem is black has this immediate counter with c5. Now your d pawn is under attack, you can't capture of course because your bishop on b2 is undefended, and after c captures, bishop captures, and e4, bishop to c6, you can never push d5. Again, your bishop is undefended here. So after you play knight to f3, now we have captures, 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 and after knight captures, queen to b6, and black has a decent game. There's really nothing to worry about here. So a very important decision here. So Tal of course played queen captures on d2, he doesn't allow any complications like this. Knight to a6, and black pretty much developed all of his pieces. It is a pretty weird square for the knight, but you know, if it works, why not? Rook 8 to c1, now defending the c4 pawn. Queen to d6, and now knight to e5. And this is an excellent square for the knight. Black will have a very hard time getting rid of it from e5. You don't really want to play a move like f6. After knight comes to d3, then your pawn structure is a bit weird around the king. You locked your dark square bishop in like this, and black no longer has any pressure on the d4 square. So no problems here for white. So after knight to e5, rook f to d8, we have rook f to d1, and now rook 8 to c8. Now all of the pieces are developed, and it's time to create a game plan. Here Tal did consider starting a pawn storm on the queen side, starting with the move c5, and after queen to b8, push b4, and then maybe prepare a4, b5, and so on and so on. But here in this position he actually did like f6 for black, and after knight retreats, now bishop to f5, and black does gain a lot of activity here. This bishop is actually posted on a nice square, and black will be ready to push e5 here, opening up the position. So after this rook 8 to c8, Tal played queen to a5, and this is an excellent move, and it's an excellent square for the queen, although it was a bit more centralized than d2. Here the queen kind of prevents this knight from moving, as the a7 pawn would be under attack. You can't kick away the queen with b6, then the knight would fall. So here Botvinnik played d captures on c4. There is an interesting line, and I will show it because, you know, it's quite an interesting line. What would happen if knight to c7 was played here? So can black actually sacrifice this pawn with the idea of maybe capturing the queen? Well, if queen captures, then of course rook attacks queen, queen to b6, rook attacks queen on a6. Queen has to capture the b7 pawn, but now comes bishop to c8, again attacking the queen. Queen goes to b8, and now rook to a8, again attacking the queen. Queen goes to b6, and now rook to a6. And what do you do here? Is this like a forced draw for black? Not really, because white has c5. This is the problem. Now after rook captures, pawn captures, and rook captures, white will simply play e3, and after all is said and done, white actually won a pawn, and he doesn't have much to show for it. Black doesn't really have much to show for. So Botvinnik not interested in any of this. After this queen to a5 move, he plays d captures on c4. We have knight captures on c4. Not b captures on c4. This does seem to improve your pawn structure, but then Botvinnik can simply exchange queens with queen to b4. Tal doesn't like this. So knight captures on c4, and here queen to c7, again offering a trade of queens. And here Tal does like queen captures on c7, knight captures, and knight to a5, simply hamming in on this b7 pawn and this c6 pawn, as the knight and bishop are now really controlling this queen side. But he thinks white can do much better than this. So after queen c7, he actually goes all the way to e1 with the queen. And this is, he says, this is the best square for the queen. She's not on c3 to be bothered by this bishop. She's not on d2 to be bothered maybe by the rook from d8. She's on e1, and she's perfectly safe there, waiting for her opportunity to get back into the game. And here Botvinnik goes queen to b8, getting the queen out of the c file. A move like bishop captures on c4 was possible, with the idea that after rook captures, now black does have this c5 move, and yes, it's true, your bishop on b2 is still undefended. You did play the freeing c5 move, but white will simply ignore you, now e4, and you can't really do anything with the c pawn since your queen is on c7. And after a move like b5, the rook moves, still black really doesn't have anything here. e6, now e5 comes, and only problems for black here. So after queen e1, first Botvinnik plays queen to b8. Now he does have some ideas of executing c5. Tal now pushes e4, and now this is another useful thing of having the queen on e1. She supports the e4 pawn, and now bishop captures on c4. Here rook captures on c4, b captures on c4 again would be met by c5. So rook captures on c4, and now knight to c7. Here bishop to h3, attacking that rook. We have e6, and now bishop to c1, with the idea that this bishop is definitely coming to f4 at some point, especially if Botvinnik would immediately want to play something like knight to b5 to bring the knight over to d6. Then the bishop on f4 would be extremely useful, as it comes there with a tempo on the queen on b8. So queen to a8, and again a weird square for the queen, but Tal agrees with Botvinnik, this is the best square for the queen. Bishop to g5 now, attacking the rook, rook to e8, and now queen to d2. With some ideas of bishop to h6, maybe exchanging this dark square bishop, and also gaining more protection of the d4 pawn. And now Botvinnik plays f5, and here Tal spent a lot of time, as this f5 move really gives a lot to black, and Tal definitely agrees this is the best move, and he did consider a lot of things. For example, if you push e5, you simply allow this knight to get this d5 square, and it's an excellent square for the knight. White doesn't really have anything here. Another thing, after f5, Tal did consider f3, maybe, to improve his position in the center, but then knight to b5, the knight is coming to d6, from there he will attack the rook on c4, this knight on e4, this pawn on e4 twice, and again, if you prevent it by playing e5, so now the knight can come to c6, to d6, and now the knight will once again return to c7, and then we'll have the d5 square available for him again. And another thing here, there was the idea of actually playing e captures on f5. Later, after the game, some of the commentators said that maybe this was the winning idea for Tal, but it really wasn't, because after e captures on f5 and e captures on f5, now g4 was the main idea. But now f captures on g4, bishop captures on g4, and now black can actually play knight to d5 and sacrifice the exchange here. And after bishop captures, queen captures, with this powerful knight on d5, and white without having a light square bishop, black definitely has at least compensation here. So after this f5 move, we have bishop to h6 now. Of course, Tal wants to exchange this strong dark square bishop. We have bishop captures, queen captures, and now rook to e7. Rook to e1, and here rook to f8. Tal plays rook to c5, with the idea of bringing the rook all the way to e5 to exert even more pressure here on the e file, so that when e captures on f5 happens, he will have doubled rooks on the e file. Queen to d8, and here Tal played rook to e5. And Botvinnik was in severe time trouble here. This is only move 27, and he still has to make 13 moves to reach time control, and he's not interested in queen captures on d4. He played rook to g7, but Tal actually thought that queen captures on d4 is actually a forced draw for black, with the idea that after e captures here, now bishop captures on f5. You can't capture because your rook would hang on e7. Now rook to f7. Now there's a triple attack on the bishop here, but now rook to e5, getting the rook out of the way with attacking the queen. Queen to f6 now. And now queen captures, rook captures, bishop captures with check, knight captures, rook captures on f2, and here you have an endgame, 4 pawns each, 2 rooks each, and that's a completely drawn endgame. So it's hard to say. Tal didn't really know if Botvinnik decided not to go for this because he didn't calculate the line all the way to a draw, or because Botvinnik maybe wanted to actually still play this game and go for a win. So here rook to g7 was played, and this is a weird move, not because it's a weird move, but because in Tal's book the move is actually rook to f7, but on the official chessgames.com database, where I take the PGNs for the games, it's actually rook to g7. But the reason it doesn't matter, because both moves lead to the same position, so it's hard to say which move was really played. Probably the one from Tal's book. But again, maybe it's just a bad copy of the book, so hard to say. But it doesn't matter. Okay, rook to g7, and here Tal played queen back to d2. He decided it was time to defend the d4 pawn now, because with this rook move, now Botvinnik is actually preparing to capture this pawn. So Tal defended it, queen to d2, and now we have queen to d6. Bishop back to f1, as there's really no point in having the bishop on h3 anymore. Now Tal is preparing to bring it all the way to c4. Rook back to d7. And now, from this position, it's totally the same. Was that move rook f7 or rook g7? E captures on f5, rook captures on f5, and rook 5 to e4. Capturing the rook, Tal agrees that maybe capturing the rook was the way to go for white, but he decided for this move. And here Botvinnik played rook to f6. which is again a weird move, because it seems once again, for some reason, whether it's severe time trouble or the fact that Botvinnik still wants to play this game for a win, decides not to go for rook to d5, because after rook to d5, there's now a triple attack on the d pawn, c5 is coming, and the only move for Tal is basically to go bishop to c4, which forces a draw. After rook captures, queen captures, rook captures, bishop captures with check, knight captures, rook captures, king to f7 attacking the rook, and rook to e2, not allowing the black rook to enter the second rank. 5 pawns each, 1 rook each. It's a drawn endgame. So for some reason, this is move 31. Botvinnik doesn't go for this. He plays rook to f6, and maybe he thought that that it's the same idea. White can't really push for advantage here. Maybe bishop to c4 will now won't really make sense, because then simply rook can block and 4 pieces are defending this pawn. So it's hard to say. Did Botvinnik really refuse a draw here, or does Botvinnik still want to win this game? Either way, he played rook to f6, and here Tal played h4. With the idea, there's a pawn on g6, why not attack it with pawn to h5? And here, again, in time trouble, Botvinnik plays king to g7, and Tal pushes h5. And Tal says, I don't really have a plan here. When I push h5, I'm just gonna see what happens. Maybe I'm gonna capture, maybe Botvinnik will play something, then I will play something, maybe I will push the pawn all the way to h6, and then maybe create something there. He has no idea here, but his having no idea plan actually works here, because Botvinnik plays g captures on h5, which kind of made his king g7 move futile. The idea of king to g7 is to actually defend the g6 pawn when Tal decides to capture with h captures on g6. But here Botvinnik kind of wastes a move with king to g7, and then captures g captures on h5, kind of ruining his pawn structure there. And Tal goes rook to h4. Now his idea is to double rooks on the h file. Move queen to g5 check, followed by rook g6 and queen captures on h5. Tal doesn't really enjoy this, as knight to d5 then is coming, and then black's game becomes very active. So after this, g captures on h5, rook to h4, and now king back to g8. So Botvinnik now has to make room for the rook, as this bishop is coming to d3, and after rook captures here, there are going to be some problems with the h7 pawn. Bishop to d3, rook to g7 now, and rook to e5 now, simply not allowing Botvinnik any tactics. Now the rook is also protecting the d4 pawn very nicely, and by blocking the queen, Tal doesn't really allow any rook captures and g3 ideas in the future. This move, this move wouldn't be possible now, because after rook captures, pawn captures, and queen captures, simply queen to g2 would not allow black to capture the rook on h4, as there's a king on g8. But it's useful. Rook to e5. This rook is also now ready to come to the h file, so definitely a nice position. Rook to f7, adding more defense to the h7 pawn, and now first queen to h6, bringing even a queen to the attack. Queen to e7, and now rook e captures on h5. So now 4 of Tal's pieces, well, 2 rooks, a bishop, and a queen are eyeing the h7 pawn. Here, knight to d5, as there's really no danger of capturing here, but knight to d5 is the crucial defensive move here, because now Tal's idea doesn't work, and he spent a lot of time calculating it, trying to make it work, but it simply doesn't work. The idea was bishop captures on h7, and after rook captures, rook to g4 check, king to h8, and now queen to g6, threatening queen to g8 checkmate. And there's only one good move here, and the only defense here is knight to f6, after which white doesn't really have anything, and this was the importance of knight c7 to knight to d5 move, because now you can't really do anything. Rook captures, and after you attack this knight, simply knight back to d5. Black is up a piece and winning this game. So when Tal saw this, it was a very nice move by Botvinnik. This knight to d5, he retreated with the queen to d2, and now he opens up the attack to the h7 pawn from the rooks. The queen doesn't have to come first. Knight to f6, attacking the rook, rook to h6, and now queen to d6. Queen to d6, perhaps not the greatest move, but this is move 40, and the Botvinnik had to make it to reach time control, so he did make it. And now Tal plays rook to f4, and this is why why maybe Tal's games are a bit more interesting, you know, than most, at least to me. He plays f4 knowingly that rook to f4 is not the best move, but it's the most complicated move, and the Botvinnik now has to make a move that will be used tomorrow. So the game will be adjourned after Botvinnik makes a move here, and he wants to make the position as complicated as possible. He now has two rooks attacking the knight on f6, and Botvinnik has to decide what to do here. He has to make a move, and you know, the position will be complicated, so Botvinnik doesn't really have an entire night to analyze a simple position. So here, Botvinnik tomorrow, when the position was continued, they saw that Botvinnik played queen to f8. And this was okay, simply defending the knight, and, you know, all is well. Queen to e3, now comes knight to d5, attacking the queen and the rook, and now rook captures on f7. Queen captures on f7, and now queen to e5. And this is probably the move Botvinnik missed in his home analysis, and why Tal enjoyed such a complicated position. Probably Botvinnik thought queen captures on e6 was going to be played. Queen captures, rook captures, rook to g4, attacking the pawn on d4, bishop to c4 here, and after king to f7, rook to h6. It would be a better position for white, but certainly black can play this, perhaps even to a draw. But here Tal played queen to e5, and it's a weird move, but Tal really does have ideas here. So what do you play here as black? First of all, you do have to make a move. None of the moves really seem that appealing. For example, queen to b8 check would pick up the a7 pawn. You do have to play something. So Botvinnik plays knight to c7, simply not allowing this. And knight to c7 is the strongest engine move, so you can't really complain about Botvinnik's move. I mean, he did play the strongest engine move, but in reality, it's simply a winning position for white, and Tal proves it very nicely. He plays queen to c5, and this was the idea. Not going for exchanges in any endgame where white does have the advantage, but simply the queen side, you know, is free for grabs. You know, the queen will pick up all of these pawns. So queen to f3, and now comes bishop captures on h7. This was the problem. Sorry, this was the problem of creating such a position, because now if you go something like queen captures on a7, then you have rook to f7, and now white is in a whole lot of problems here. There's the problem of capturing on f2, and also white's bishop is attacked on d3. So you'd have to protect the f2 pawn, or you'd have to make a move like d5, and then black simply captures the bishop, and being a piece down, black is winning this game. But after queen to f3, Tal found bishop captures on h7, rook captures on h7, and now queen to g5. And here, black is in trouble. If you go rook to g7 blocking, you get queen to d8 check. And now if king blocks, simply queen captures knight, so you'd have to play queen to f8, but this really doesn't help you, as rook to h8 wins the queen. King captures, queen captures on f8, you lose the queen and the game. So after queen g5, Botvinnik tried queen to h8, but it's no better. Queen to d8 check, and now you have to go to the 7th rank with the king. King to g7, rook captures, king captures, and now queen captures on c7. King moves, and now queen captures on b7. And after this little skirmish, Tal started with bishop captures on h7. Tal is actually up 2 pawns, and a queen and pawn endgame being up 2 pawns, white is completely winning. So queen to e4. Here Tal played queen to a6. He doesn't want to grab the a7 pawn, as he's not sure if he will be able to prevent all of the checks. But with queen a6, he finds the idea. We have queen to b1 check, king moves, now queen to e4 check, king moves to f1, queen b1 check, king e2, queen c2 check, king f3, queen f5 check, king to e3, and now queen to g5 check, king e2, queen to h5 check, king d2, and now king to f6. There's no point in checking anymore, because the king will be able to hide behind the pawns. And only now queen captures on c6. So now you're up 3 pawns as white, and it's only a matter of technique how you're going to end this game. Queen to a5 check, we have queen to c3 blocking, giving up the a2 pawn, but it doesn't matter. Queen captures, king to e3 now. The king is now well protected. King to f7, and now the final finesse to finish this game is d5. d5 simply with the idea of temporarily sacrificing a pawn, but this will create a very nice past g and past f pawn, which are connected pawns, so that's pretty much unstoppable. E captures on d5, we have queen to c7 check, king e6, queen to c6 check, king e7, and now queen captures on d5, so grabbing that sacrificed pawn. Queen to a1, queen to e4, king to f7, king to f4, queen to c1, king to g4, queen to a1, now queen to d5 check, king moves, and now king to f5, we have queen to b1 check, king to f6, and it was in this position that Mikhail Botvinnik resigned the game. So game 11 went to Mikhail Tal. He's once again 2 points in the lead, and he managed to grab a win by playing knight to f3 on the first move as white. This is huge for Tal, so now with two points in the lead and being confident in his ability to create real complications over the board and then prevail in those complications is definitely what he needs to win this match. So yeah. That's the game. I do hope you enjoyed it. We're gonna pick up on this match as soon as possible, but you know, for the next 2 days, I will be pretty busy covering the candidates. But yeah, I do hope you enjoyed this. I would like to thank Josip Gavrić, Christian Gavrić, Boris Mrkonjić, Given Manai, Jasprit Shahid, Pete Marshall, Rodney Christian, and Paul Gibbons for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, probably with a nice game from the candidates. Thank you all.